Hive office, and it's springtime and there's lots of nectar coming in, which is pretty exciting. The bees have also got excited, they've built up, and we've had a couple of swarms. So what we're going to do today is check the swarms, because if you put a new swarm into a box where you're using foundationless frames, you need to check regularly in the first few weeks to make sure they're really building straight on the comb guides. So let's take a look at that now. These swarms left from, I think it was this hive, and it landed on a branch down this way. If you come down here, you can see that we've had a swarm that was here on this branch, which has ended up in this box, and another one here, which we've put in this box. So if you roll back a couple of videos in our Facebook live feed, you'll see a swarm check from one that came about 4 weeks ago. Now, it built perfectly on the guides. However, I peeked inside this hive and realized that the bees haven't built perfectly on the guides, and we need to intervene to make sure we can get straight comb so it's easy to inspect those frames later. So a little bit of smoke in the entrance, and then I'm just going to lift up that lid. Looks like there's quite a few bees on the lid, so just make sure the queen isn't orphaned. If we have a little look, we want to make sure the queen's staying in the hive. Okay. Now I'm going to just lift up the inner cover. Again, just checking, make sure we can't see the queen. Sometimes she is just sitting on the inside of the inner cover here. Okay, I can't see the queen, but I'm going to put this right at the entrance, like so, so that if she is there, she's got more chance of just crawling back into the hive. So next, I'm just going to add a little bit of smoke where I want to start working. I'm going to start right on the edge of the hive here and lift out that first frame. So I can see across already that there's a bit of burr and brace comb between the frames. Basically, beekeepers use terms like burr comb, brace comb, bridge comb, and cross comb to describe where bees have put wax, which is undesirable to us. Basically, the bees will use any space they can to build their comb, and it's perfectly fine to them, but to us we want them in nice straight lines on the comb so we can inspect these frames and then make sure the brood is nice and healthy. If they do go wonky, it's a real problem later to inspect those frames. I'm just going to lift out this first frame now. And you can see them festooning there, preparing to build their comb. And you can see there's a little bit of beautiful comb here that isn't on the comb guide. If you have a look at that, the comb guide is here centered, and they've actually built it not on the comb guide. So that's an issue, and the earlier you catch that, the better. So what we're going to do, in this case, we could just remove that bit, and hopefully they'll start on the comb guide the next time. I'm just going to shake the bees off, just above the hive, like so. There's a few things you could try here. One is you could push it back onto the guide, and we'll try and do that, although it's such a small piece, it's likely just to break off. But I'm going to try anyway, so I've got the tool, and I am just going to move it across like so, pushing the wax onto the guide. So that's broken off, and that's okay. It's only a small piece. If it had more joining either side, then we could have just pushed that bent bit back onto the guide like so. So keep your wax. Don't leave it near the hive in case it's got honey in it. And you can save it for a candle later. So I'm just going to scrape away the remnants of where they've started there, and hopefully they'll start on the guide on the next frame. So, I'm pulling out the very next frame now. Okay, beautiful, look at that. It's a heart. Now, you can see here, they've built it quite nicely on the comb guide. So the comb guide is basically just a stick that goes into the upper slot in the frame. And to me, it's really nice to let the bees draw their comb naturally, like so. And you don't have to do all of that wax and wiring. The drawback though is you get wonky comb sometimes that you have to fix up and get the bees back in straight lines. However, that can still happen with wax foundation, and it can still happen with plastic foundation. In fact, plastic foundation, I've found that they will go the most wonky on because they tend to build crossways between the frames. So what I'm going to do is attempt to push that back online. That little center section could just be nudged a little bit. So if I turn that around, if I find a spot where I can keep the frame steady, we have to be careful when the naturally drawn comb is just attaching like this, not to break it off. So I'm going to attempt to just push it across here in the center, just by cutting it off there and then bending that back onto the guide like so. Have a look at that. I've cut and I've pushed that in. The bees will fix that up, and now they will be straight on the guide. So we might just leave that frame out to give us a little more room for the next ones, because I can see quite a bit of comb that's not online. If I just move that a little ways away, there we go. So the next frame I can see has the same indentation. See, what happens is the bees tend to, if they start building curved, then they'll follow suit. They'll follow one frame after another in that same curved pattern, which isn't helpful for us when we're trying to inspect the frames. Bees, however, think it's a perfectly good thing to do. So again, let's see if I can just push that back in line. Just by digging my hive tool into that curved bit and cutting that along here. The risk, of course, is that you cut the whole piece off, in which case you can either rubber band it back on, which I'll show you later. I actually didn't put my my bee suit on. That's hilarious. If you're new to beekeeping, do make sure you wear a bee suit. Some people are severely allergic to bees. This hive, however, is quite calm, and I haven't even bothered to put my hood on. But I will now, because I can detect the bees are getting a little more antsy. So, making sure you have your gloves also present. If you're new to beekeeping, wear a good bee suit, wear gloves. We have beekeeping suits and gloves and tools available, which you can purchase from our store. Now, that was the next frame. The next frame has the same pattern again, so I'm just going to lift up the next one and basically repeat the same process. It's getting more wonky now. You can see that poking out. On this side you can see it indented. So again, we're just going to cut and push that back in line. So you can see there's lots of bees. I've actually just put my finger right on one and I've got a sting in my finger. If you want to have a look at that, it's just a little sting in my finger here. It's good to know your first aid. We've got first aid information on our site about bee stings. Now, I'll try not to put my fingers on the bees this time. Okay, so same thing again, trying not to squash any bees where I'm resting the comb. And I'm just cutting here like so, here like so. And then we're going to bend that back onto the guide. There'll be a bit of honey spillage. That's okay, the bees will clean up honey spills inside the hive. So that's now in line, as you can see, nice and straight. And the bees will continue working from that straighter edge. Sometimes you can turn the frame around, so you're sort of breaking the pattern a bit. However, if you do that, just make sure you haven't got comb that's pressing up against each other. If you've got lots of small hive beetles around, like we do, you don't want to have areas in the hive that aren't accessible by the bees. So just be careful if you're turning frames around that there still is a gap between the frames big enough for the bees to squeeze in and service that area. So the next one, smoker's gone out, is the same thing, but the pattern's getting a little more and more wonky as we go. Okay, perhaps Sadie, if you could relight that. I think there's a lighter in the box. If you do have any questions, please put them in the comments below and I'll try and answer them. Also let us know where you're watching from. We've got Flow Hive beekeepers in 120 different countries now, so it's fascinating to us to hear where you're tuning in from, and also helps us tailor our YouTube live sessions, Q&As to suit the area where you are and the season that is going on for you. So again, we're just going to pull out the frame. And what's starting to happen now is the pattern seems to be moving more and more off the guide. So it's going to get more and more tricky to actually keep this comb straight. So there's a few techniques you can use. One is rubber bands to help actually steady the comb if you cut it too much off the guide. So I'm going to do that now. And you can use this if you're doing cutting a hive out of a wall cavity or something like that. The rubber band technique does help to get bits of brood comb and actually secure them in a frame so you can get a wild hive and put it into a box. So just putting the rubber band over the comb like so. I'm going to get another one. What that will mean is if I do cut it right off the guide, the rubber bands will just hold the comb together. After a while the bees chew through that rubber band, and then the comb's by that time well attached to the frame. It's a little bit tricky. Sometimes an extra hand is good in this situation. So rubber bands are a technique to secure comb in when it's actually disconnected from the top of the guide. So if you've cut it off accidentally or you've tilted it and it's fallen off, you can rubber band it back in like so. Now I'm going to attempt to just move this over now without cutting those rubber bands. So I'm cutting a lot of the comb off now.